Lord Rishabdev is an avatar of Vishnu, an incarnation of the personality of Godhead. How'd you like to have an incarnation of the personality of Godhead as your dad? Very special. So we'll start by hearing a little bit about his father, Rishabdev. His name, Rishabha, means the best, because he was supremely virtuous. That's how his father was known, Rishabha, or Rishabdev. And he ruled the whole earth for a long time. And there are certain features that he was known by. We'll come to those in a moment. One of them was giving teachings. So those of you that are a little familiar with the structure of Srimad Bhagavatam, he appeared as one of the descendants of Manu, in the line of Swayambhuva Manu, the first of the 14 Manus, and he had 100 sons. The eldest of those 100 sons was Bharata Maharaj. And when Bharata Maharaj was elderly enough to look after the kingdom, he gave a very nice set of instructions, Canto 5, Chapter 5, about transcendental life, very elevated. It takes many, for me at least, it took many readings to receive all of what he was saying, or a substantial part of what he was saying. And they're often quoted verse, let's say, I remember very clearly in the Vrindavan Gurukul, at a time when the Vrindavan Gurukul was right in that echo chamber of the Gurukul structure. Every morning at a certain time, the boys would get together and chant the instructions of Rishabdev to his sons at the top of their lungs. It was really nice. And so it was an essential part of their training, Gurukula training. Now I'm sure, although I don't know, the historical fact, but everything was done by Prabhupada's instructions. So they, every day. So it went in. If you do something every day that's in a transcendental nature, it goes in. So hearing Rishabdev's instructions was essential for understanding the mission of life and how to go about it. So that's the scene that you see in this nice painting. And you look around, and there's Brahmanas, there's his sons, and many other people. Big assembly. I don't see any amplification system. He must have had a good voice. And as we read through his life, of these 100 sons, it's important. Some of them, like he, became Kshatriyas. Many of them didn't become Kshatriyas. Many of them became Brahmanas. And 9 of them, we don't hear about them till much later, till the 11th canto of the Bhagavatam, but they became perfected souls like Narada Muni. Perfected souls like Narada Muni means they had mystic powers. They could travel anywhere they wanted in the universe without an airplane or anything. They just zoom, off they go. They didn't even have a vina. They just and they came to different places and gave transcendental instructions. One of those series of transcendental instructions that's notable is in the early part of the 11th canto. So those 9, the Navayogendras, were sons of Rishabdev. So here's some of the things that we know about Rishabdev. This is from Jiva Goswami's Laghu Bhagavatamrita. Rishabdev, as you see in the red letters there, He's in the category of a Prabhava avatar. Prabhava avatars are of two kinds, and he's not at the first. The first kind is briefly manifest and not very famous. Mohini, Hamsa, and the Yoga avatars beginning with Shukla. So we don't hear much about them because that's the category that they're in. We hear something. The second are authors of scriptures. Rishabdev follows in that category. Generally, they are great sages. Among them is Dhanvantari, Rishabha, Vyasa, Dattatreya, and Kapila. So if we want to, we could go through and describe a little bit about each one. Somebody in the audience want to say something about Dhanvantari? Practically everybody knows about Dhanvantari. What did Dhanvantari do? Dhanvantari. Ayurveda. Ayurveda. Rishabha gave teachings that are in 5th Canto, Chapter 5. I'm unaware of anything that he wrote, but he certainly gave teachings, and those teachings are recorded. Vyasa we know, the literary author, incarnation, who wrote down the Vedas from a spoken to a written form. Dattatreya, who wants to say something about Dattatreya? He's in this category of Prabhava avatars. Gave teachings. Who wants to say? Anyone? Yes? Yes, he's son of Atri and Anasuya. What about his teachings? Say a sage that gave teachings, Dattatreya's teachings. Atri and Anasuya underwent austerities for a long, long time, wishing to have a son that's in the category of the avatars. So he didn't specify which avatar, so all three of them showed up. Maybe you've seen that painting. They're hovering in the sky, and he wants all three of them to become his son. So they said yes. So Lord Vishnu's avatar was Dattatreya, partial incarnation, and Lord Shiva's partial incarnation was Durvasa Muni, and who was the other one? Lord Brahma's partial incarnation? Soma. So he was busy. And what is Dattatreya known for? This is not on our topic, it's just churning the topic a little bit. He's a mysterious personality. When you see paintings of Dattatreya, you'll notice there's dogs. Right? Now what's he doing with dogs? He's a form of Vishnu because he didn't see distinctions. So he was sometimes thought of as teaching impersonalism, but Vishnu doesn't teach impersonalism. The fundamentals, making no distinctions on the material platform, is like what the impersonalists do, but he had special teachings. He also gave nice teachings to Vaishnavas. So he's a bit of a mystery, Dattatreya. And Kapila we know. Sankhya philosophy, Kapila. Here's a nice painting of Rishabdev. And again, it's from Jiva Goswami's Laghu Bhagavatamrita. The fair-complexioned Lord Rishabdev appeared to teach the duties of the renounced order. He was quite renounced, after he gave up his kingdom, he remained in the royal palace for some time, and then he left the royal palace and he wandered here and there, and as time passed, he became a bit of a madman, at least externally, totally detached. So the duties of the renounced order. He showed the path of perfection, which is followed by those who have fully controlled their senses and who are honored by all orders of life. So the topmost stage of renunciate. He set that example. So detached was he that people thought he was mad. And this is a painting of Rishabdev where he's being taunted and spoken of harshly, and little boys throwing things at him. And he was not responding to the worldly prompts that most people would become irritated by. But he was totally detached. It's said, one of the things that happened towards the end of his life, he was residing on a mountain, and the mountain burst into flames, and that's how he disappeared. That's his father. But before his father disappeared, his son, Bharat, became the ruler. And because he was given that responsibility by his father, and he carried it out. He divided the world in different kingdoms and had some of his brothers in charge of some of those kingdoms, and he ruled the world. And there were others that were also Kshatriyas that assisted those principal brothers. And he did a good job. He ruled according to the conclusions of Scripture. And he was loved by everybody, so much so they renamed the planet after him. Now often, those of you that are accustomed to hearing Prabhupada's lectures, often Prabhupada would say that Bharata Maharaj renounced the kingdom when he was still very young. And have you heard him say that? When he was just still 24, Prabhupada would say it again and again. And that may be a different Bharata Maharaj, because the Bhagavatam writes that he ruled for 1,000 times 10,000 years. That's a little different than 24. But there may be different Bharatas, and that's quite okay. Bhagavatam reads, when that period was finished, he retired from family life and divided the wealth he had received from his forefathers among his sons. So what did he do after that? There's three. Some of you know who Bhakti Marg Swami is. He's a dramatist. He writes dramas and enacts the dramas. He would perform this in Mayapur several times, every evenings, and then he traveled around the country along with the Rath Yatra and performed it in temples. So it's like the three lives of Bharat. He's a good dramatist. So 3 lives. This is the first of those 3. And when he was quite elderly and fixed in bhakti, he went to Pulaha Ashrama along the Gandaki River in Haridwar. And the painting shows he was engaged in chanting Gayatri Mantra and other mantras. The commentary says that the Gayatri Mantra is the worship of a form, not the worship of the sun, but worship of the presiding deity of the sun. Because some people, there are different people that chant Gayatri Mantra. Some people think they're worshipping the sun, because the sun is mentioned in the Gayatri Mantra, Savitur. Some people think that's what it is. Some people think it's the worship of the impersonal Brahman, because the impersonal Brahman, some people think, that's where the sun comes from, or the Jyoti of the sun comes from the Jyoti of the impersonal Brahman. And so those persons that chant Gayatri Mantra, they take it that they're worshipping the impersonal Brahman through Gayatri Mantra. And Vaishnavas, on the other hand, so there's these 3 categories of worshippers, they worship, the commentary says, Prabhupada writes, Hiranmaya. Hiranmaya is the name of the Supreme Lord Narayana, and Prabhupada's explanation is the sun god, each of the heavenly planets and higher planets, they have a presiding deity that's a form of Vishnu. And in the sun planet, there's a presiding deity of Narayana that is worshipped by the Gayatri Mantra, or Hiran Maya. So that's what he was doing. Other mantras as well, but he was definitely a Vaishnava. And he had achieved very, very elevated stages. There's descriptions of, in this section, just like this picture shows. He achieved the bhava stage of bhakti. The bhava stage of bhakti, many of you know, according to Rupa Goswami, is the stage just before prema. There's nothing beyond prema, so it's the stage just before the topmost stage of bhakti. And he had achieved it. He was, when doing what this painting is showing, he wasn't just chanting his mantra and doing sadhana bhakti. He was doing beyond sadhana bhakti, ecstatic. And those who like to read Nectar Devotion, or maybe some of you like to read Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, written directly by Rupa Goswami, there's details and details of what is this type of worship that Bharata Maharaj had perfected. And it was the Bhava Bhakti. He was absorbed. It's important. We'll circle back to this. Now, because he's by the side of the Gandaki River in Haridwar, he had daily practices. Those who are in the bhava stage, they don't have the need to attain something because they're on the spontaneous stage. However, they do because that's their life. So in his regulation, he would bathe in the early morning in the Gandaki River, apply his tilak after bathing, and sit by the side of the river and chant his Gayatri Mantra, like many devotees do early in the morning. And one particular morning, he saw on the opposite shore of the river, there was a deer, a female deer, and deer sometimes are a little nervous about how they might be attacked. So she was drinking water, raising her head, looking, drinking water, raising her head, looking, and drinking water from the Gandaki River. And as that was going on, suddenly there was a loud roar of a lion. And she panicked. And there's a nice description. Those of you that know ladies that are in the stage of pregnancy, it's very important that they don't have any startling experiences, emotional startling experiences, because it can be the cause of premature birth. So that's what happened to this deer. She panicked. And the child, the baby deer, called fawn, was born prematurely and right by the side of the river. And in her panic, she also jumped. She jumped into the river. The river was fast flowing. She got swept away by the current of the river, washed downstream, came by the waves, was pushed to the shore. And this was all seen and heard by Bharata Maharaj. And so, what did Bharata Maharaj do? He was a king, or at least previously. He had now retired from kingly duties, but kings protect. Kshatriyas give protection. And so he went across the river. This shows a very slow-moving river, but fast-moving river. He went to the other side and rescued the fawn. And there's many verses describing his contemplations. So he was a protector type of personality, and he was on the very elevated stage of bhakti. However, his bhakti was being overtaken by the intensity of his affection for this little helpless deer. In essence, making a lot of verses short, he became like the father and the mother, because here's this little baby deer that had no father, no mother, at least to protect him. So he became the protector of the deer. And he carried on every day doing his nice devotional duties. However, he also became distracted. And sometimes it may happen, you continue with your duties, but if you're attached to something other than your worship or whatever it is that you're doing, you can be doing something and the mind is somewhere else. It can happen, especially in the sadhana stage. It's very common. And so the idea for sadhakas is to bring the mind back under the control of the self, as Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita. But he didn't do that. According to the commentaries, this is important. He gradually slackened. He continued the practices, but one of the practices of yoga is pratyahara. What does pratyahara mean? You know the meaning? Pratyahara. It's one of the stages of the Eightfold Yoga system. Have you heard the term before? What does it mean? Withdraw the mind. Yama niyama, asana, pranayama. Number 5 is pratyahara. So he was accomplished in that process. All the persons of his age were accomplished in that process. But he didn't withdraw his mind from worldly things. He withdrew his mind from his practices. He continued with the practices mindlessly. Maybe some of you know what that feels like. But it's not bhakti. He desisted in his bhakti, although he continued the practices. So we see he's doing his fire yagyas and chanting of mantras and doing his practices, but he was very distracted. And there's verses after verses after verses of describing his inner contemplation, but his bhakti slackened. And then there's some discussion about why did his bhakti slacken, because he was on this very elevated stage. It's one of those classic questions that comes up in Bhakti Sandarbha. At what point in time is it possible that you won't fall? And one of the answers is, even in the Bhava Bhakti stage, one can fall. And the classic example is Bharat. Here's what Bhakti Sandarbha says. Ordinary fruitive activities are not strong enough to create such an impediment or a fall down, speaking of Bharat, in the path of devotional service. Therefore, the fruitive activities mentioned here must have been offenses performed in a previous birth. In this way, King Bharata is like King Indradumna and other devotees that committed offenses. So some of you know the King Indradumna story. He was visited by a sage. He was so absorbed in what he was doing that he didn't even acknowledge the sage because he was so absorbed in a trance of meditation. The sage became angry and cursed him that he would become an elephant. So he became Gajendra. But it was actually a benediction because very quickly Gajendra achieved the spiritual world. So like Indradumna Maharaj, who offended a sage by inattentiveness to the proper social etiquettes. When an elevated person comes, there are certain etiquettes. He didn't because he was absorbed in meditation. It wasn't like ignoring him, but by arrangement of the divine nature, he was cursed, so he could get delivered very quickly. So similarly, that was the offense whereby he became an elephant. Similarly, this is the offense. And the commentary goes on to say it was done consciously. He neglected the internal portion of his bhakti practices consciously, and thus his bhakti slackened. So say it again, the other way. Is it possible for bhakti to slacken even in the bhava bhakti stage? The answer is yes. So should we be careful? We're not at the bhava bhakti stage. Should we be careful? Yes. Because even on the royal road, there's danger of an accident. That's the lesson. Here's commentary. King Bharata's willful neglect of bhakti due to a past offense, that was a previous lifetime. Doesn't say what that offense was, just says prior to being Bharata Maharaj, some previous lifetime he made some offense. And he received the reaction for that offense by fall down, by consciously slacking in his bhakti practice. So who can say behind us, somewhere back there, there was some previous lives for sure, and then maybe, quite possibly, there was some offense back there somewhere that we don't even know what it is. And so that's a risk. So going forward, we want to be very careful to avoid offenses because there's consequences. It's said specifically in this whole context. The reactions to sins are far less severe than the reactions for offense, because the bhakti process can cleanse away the consequences of sin. Even Abbas Bhakti can do that. But he's on the Bhava Bhakti platform, and a past offense kicked in. Now he had to make a conscious choice, and he made the conscious choice to slacken. And there was consequences. Because if you consciously or unconsciously slacken, there's consequences. In his case, it was conscious. Here's Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary. Bharata's fall was arranged by the Lord for the purpose of increasing his longing for bhakti after taking birth as a deer. And then that's the second life. And the third life was as a brahmana. So we're going to hear a lot about Jad Bharat, the third life. So what happened as he was continuing and continuing and continuing with attachment and attachment, his mind was on the deer while he was doing his regulative activities, just like our minds may be on something or something while we're doing our regulative activities. And that wherever the mind goes, that's where you go. So one evening, the deer disappeared. And he became a little obsessive about finding the deer. After having slackened in his internal submission unto the personality of Godhead, he began in the middle of the night looking for the deer. And as he was moving around looking for the deer, by misfortune, he came to the edge of a cliff and fell off the cliff. And as he was falling to the jagged rocks below, what was his mind on? His mind was on the deer. And because his mind was upon the deer, that's what happened. Yam yam vapi smaran bhavam chachantante kalevaram. Do you know the verse? Do you know the meaning? Smaran means remember. So whatever the mind is fixed upon, whatever you're remembering, chajatante, at the end of giving up the body, chajatante, kalevaram, for sure, that's where the soul is going to go, because the mind is fixed on something, and the mind carries the soul to the next destination. So he was fixed on the deer, that he just became, the caretaker for, the mother, father, and he was absorbed. And so he left his body and that circumstance, and he became a deer in his next life. And as he became a deer in his next life, he was gifted by Super Soul with faculties that most people don't have, what to speak of deer don't have, because he was so elevated. Super Soul gave him remembrance of his previous life as a Bhava Bhakta, Bharata Maharaj. So he remembered his previous life and remembered the mistake that he made, and he was then in a body of a deer, remembering all that, and very fixed in, I'm not going to do that again. He learned his lesson. And although he took his birth as a deer some distant place, he again went to this Pulaha ashram, where he knew that there were sages, and he stayed near them, so he could be in their company. He could take the remnants of prasad when they wanted to feed, because he was a nice, affectionate little deer. And he heard their conversations about transcendence, because that was what he was absorbed in from his previous life. And he lived his whole life as a deer, like that. And when he left, because his mind was still fixed on attaining this higher stage of bhakti, in his next life, he became the son of a brahmana. And because he had the same surname, Bharata, but because he was acting as if he was a dullard, he became known as Jada Bharata. And he began roaming here and there like a madman. His father tried everything, because the father was a brahmana. Let me teach my son all the Brahminical things that young boys need to learn. And he would act as if he couldn't understand. He would be given an instruction, he would do just the opposite and smile. Not, he just didn't speak, but his father tried and he tried and he tried, and he realized it's not going to happen. And so as his body matured, he began roaming around not as a brahmana, but an avaduta, consciously, purposefully, not getting involved in worldly things. And as a result, in different ways, there's just descriptions in the 5th canto. Even his brothers would taunt him, or village people would taunt him, prod him, make fun of him, poke sticks at him, and he was just oblivious. He didn't respond with anger, and he didn't speak. So he played the role of an avaduta, Jada Bharata. After some time, Prabhupada discusses this. There were some worshippers of goddess Kali, and they got this unusual idea of making a human sacrifice of him. And Prabhupada explained, this isn't a standard practice. They were very low-class people that wanted to sacrifice the life of Bharata. They thought, this would make a good goddess Kali will be very pleased. So they prepared his body, this and that and the other thing and the other thing, and they were ready to chop him with a chopping block and cut his head off and offer it to goddess Kali. And the Bhagavatam describes goddess Kali burst out of the deity form, and with her own chopper she chopped their heads. Finished. Now he didn't pray to her or anything. That's what she did, because she couldn't stand seeing such an elevated soul being treated in such a bad way. So she finished them. This is all in his life of Jada Bharat. And then the final episode, it takes several chapters, but Jada Bharat was invited into some service, or conscripted into some service of carrying the palanquin for the king. Because generally speaking, there's 4, 2 in the front, 2 in the back, and they didn't have the other man in the front, and so they saw this stout, strong, dull person. He would make a good palanquin carrier, so they engaged him in carrying the palanquin, which he did with no objection. Although he's a Uttama Adhikari Vaishnav, he didn't protest. So he's carrying the palanquin of the king. You know the story. He's looking down at his feet because on the path where the palanquin was being moved, there were ants. He was carefully avoiding stepping on the ants. And as he was carefully avoiding stepping on the ants, the palanquin carrying wasn't done smoothly. So there we see that King Rahugana is looking over the side of the palanquin, saying nasty things, insulting things. And he expected that would be sufficient and Jed Bharat would carry the palanquin properly because he's the king. And so they continued, and the same thing happened. There's another painting. And as he insulted Rahugana, insulted Jed Bharat again, for the first time, at least the first time in this whole fifth canto, we hear of Jed Bharat speaking. He spoke transcendental knowledge to the king. Basically saying, you think that you're the body, and because you think that you're the body, you think I'm the servant and you're the master, but this is simply illusion, and details and details and details and details and details and details. And Rahugana is hearing all this, so he was puffed up, proud because of his position, but he also had some merit. Now, it doesn't say this specifically, but it's kind of intuitive. Jed Bharat understood something about King Rahugana, that he had some qualification that others may not have had. And so he spoke transcendental knowledge to him, and it had an impact. The impact was the king got down from his palanquin, fell at his feet, and expressed, I thought you were a dullard, but from hearing what you just spoke, I can understand you're not at all. You're a very, very elevated soul. So my humblest of apologies, he was falling at his feet, literally, and asking for forgiveness. And then he said, you see, there's some ants on the road. I couldn't understand what you said. Could you say it again? I'm paraphrasing. And so Jed Bharat said it again, second time. I'm going to read a little section. It's right in the footnotes. The Brahmin said, this person, the one who thinks of as moving around on the earth and who is a transformation of that earth, O earthly one, for what reason would your lordship, with these feet and above them these ankles, calves, knees, thighs, waist, neck, shoulders, and upon those shoulders the wooden palanquin upon which the one sits, who is thus known as the king of Sauvira, impose this haughty insistence of the I, the king of Sindhu, and thus be a captive of falsehood? He was confrontational, challenging him. And the king accepted it. And so after the second time around, he understood better and then said, you're not an ordinary person. And could you elaborate on what you've just explained the second time? And so Jed Bharat did. In the painting, on the left side of the palanquin, you see there's some trail of ants. And this is a very serious event, so there's many paintings of describing the event. There's a very detailed, the third time around, he describes the forest of illusion. It is metaphorical. It takes a while to go through it and understand this means that. But it's the plight of a person who is in illusion. And the forest of material enjoyment, where it's not enjoyment at all. And my dear king, that's where you are. You're thinking to be the enjoyer as the king, but you're in thick illusion, and therefore you're a foolish man. So that's the painting, the forest of illusion, the king and his attendants. And after hearing 3 times, the king realizes his position. Not material is something that was taken from him by these teachings, and then the spiritual conception. And he eventually came to the stage of complete spiritual understanding. I'll read from the purport. The king of Sovira, sure of an elevated position, came to a full understanding of the truth of the Oversoul. Within himself, he managed to completely give up the conception of a bodily self that he erroneously, in nescience, had attributed to the person, to his person, and thus, O king, followed he on the path of disciplic succession to the Lord. So he became a follower of Jad Bharat. And there's many lessons in the teachings between the two. They were not the body, etc., etc., etc. But then the full shelter in the personality of God. With the similar to Bhagavad Gita, the first part of Bhagavad Gita is the dismantling of the bodily conception, because you can't go on to something beyond that if you're still immersed in the bodily conception. There's a lot of discussion. And then the consequences of living one's life in the bodily conception, it's not attractive. So the king gave it up under the influence of, and in the association of Jad Bharat. Now there's another very important part that comes towards the end, of almost at the very end of their exchange. This is from the verse. There were some waves of dissatisfaction in the mind of Jada Bharat due to his being insulted by King Rahugana, who made him carry his palanquin. But Jada Bharata neglected this, and his heart again became calm and quiet like an ocean. So I'll read some more, but what does this mean? It means, even in the stage of Bhava Bhakti, there may be some disturbances in the mind of a person who's at the stage of Bhava Bhakti. And it wasn't the disturbance that caused his fall, it was the past offense that caused his fall from the king, and he then suffered the consequence of that past offense. He suffered the consequence by a circumstance being arranged and making the wrong choices. Supposing any one of us have made some unknowing offense. Is it possible? It's almost certain. Some unknowing offense. And what's the consequence? It's more insidious than sin. Offense is more dangerous. So it doesn't go away easily. The offense and the consequence of offense. So when that comes, then we, like Bharata Maharaj, need to make some choices. If we don't make the right choices, then we can make the wrong choices. So what do you do when there's some disturbance in the mind? If you make the right choice, you carry on with the bhakti process. You may not know what that offense was back there that's caused this circumstance in your life that's a disturbance. That's okay. You don't have to know all your past lives. And what do you do when that disturbance comes? Make the right choices. And what's the right choices? Steadfastly stay not only in the practices of bhakti, but manmana, part of bhakti. Because they're separate. Manmana, you know the meaning? Man-mana, think of me. Mana, mind. Man-mana, think of me, Krishna says. Bhava mad-bhakto, become my bhakta. Bhava mad-bhakto. So there's the activities, but there's also what the mind does. Because bhakti has these two parts. There's more than two parts, but fundamentally, what the body does and what the mind does. And it's important when some disturbance comes, where does your mind go? And if you have shelter, that's good. Because when you have shelter, you can just take shelter. Here's a prompt. You're walking along the path of your life, or a day, or something. And here comes something hurtful. Somebody says something mean. Somebody does something hurtful. Something. And then, what do you do? Depends on where your shelter is. That's what you do. So what do we do? To prepare ourselves, we take shelter. So when the disturbance comes, we don't move from that position of shelter. Even up to the bhava stage of bhakti. It's an important lesson. That's why it's in the Bhagavatam. Because the Bhagavatam is the graduate study of the undergraduate study. And the graduate study teaches us not only a principle, but gives example, so we can understand better the principle through example. And this is what we should do. Here's what you should do. It's in the Dhruva story also. There's react and respond. React is, oh yeah, like somebody kicks you in the shin. I'll show you. And that's react. That's what Dhruva did. I'm going to get back at my stepmother. Big time. Watch me. And that was his Kshatriya spirit. It was the wrong thing. His mother couldn't persuade him. Narada couldn't persuade him. But his bhakti practices under Narada's direction purified him. So that's what we need to do. Go beyond the reacting. And then when something happens that's unpleasant, because it does happen in the world in which we live, there's duality, sometimes and sometimes. Sometimes it's nice. Sometimes it's not nice. And there are a lot of not nice. And even the things that are nice are not really nice. They just appear to be nice, and they keep you hooked on going after what looks nice. And then you get kicked. The very memorable lecture I remember Prabhupada giving in the Brooklyn Temple, July 71, 72, hot summer in July. And Prabhupada was saying, several things. One of the things he was saying is, if you remain undisturbed when there's no cause for disturbance, that's not something so wonderful. When you remain undisturbed when there's cause for disturbance, that's something wonderful. And how is that possible? You have shelter. Say it the other way. If you don't have shelter, it's not possible. You can cosmetically paint it, but it's not what's inside. So how do you get it inside? When there's actual shelter. And when there's actual shelter, even there's cause for disturbance, you can remain undisturbed. So back to Bharata Maharaj, or Jad Bharat, rather. He was in the bhava stage, and his mind was perturbed. Here, take a visual. There's a visual of, there's a river, and there's waves, and the surface of the water is agitated because there's waves coming and going. But supposing you're at a pond, you have a little pebble, and you put some pebble in the pond. There's some disturbance at the surface of the water, but it's not going to remain for long. Advancement in the bhakti path means we actually have shelter, and then some cause for disturbance may come, like this that you see on the screen. There were waves of dissatisfaction in his mind because he was insulted. Now, going back in time, not only was he insulted, but there were some miscreants, worshippers of Kali, that wanted to kill him. And he remained undisturbed. He didn't have to protect himself. Kali personified protected him. chop their heads, etc., etc. The taunting, there's so many things. So one can remain undisturbed, but somehow he became agitated with with Rahugana. And so he spoke transcendental knowledge. So he was disturbed, but very quickly, he neglected the disturbance, the harsh words. Twice it happened, but he didn't respond. He neglected them. And his heart again became calm and quiet like an ocean. Although King Rahugana had insulted him, he was a great Paramahamsa. So may you all become great Paramahamsas. Because in this world, there's always going to be something. And if it's not something, that's 10 somethings. There's always going to be something that's irritating by somebody that's, uncultured and say something, do something. Now what do? If you're a Paramahamsa, you may feel some disturbance. In Jad Bharat's case, he was feeling some dissatisfaction by being insulted. But very quickly it became settled. Being a Vaishnava, he was naturally very kind-hearted, and he therefore told the king about the constitutional position of the soul. He then forgot the insult because King Rahugana pitifully begged pardon at his lotus feet. Now what to speak of Jad Bharata, even Krishna? So what about little us? Sometimes people will say bad things. They said bad things about Krishna, right? You know the story? Who was the person who said bad things about Krishna and Krishna tolerated it? Jarasandha? Another one is Shishupal? Duryodhana? Any more? Satyajit. That's the one I was thinking. So Krishna didn't become disturbed. What do you do when somebody says something that's inappropriate? Of course, if you're Krishna, have your Sudarshan chakra by your side. But if you're not Krishna, then you tolerate tangs tatiksha swabharata. And what Krishna did was he stood by the truth. That's an important lesson. Stand by the truth can mean different things. But what Krishna did in that case is he gathered some village elders from the city, Dwarka. They went out into the forest to find out, to verify what's the real story. They found out what was the real story. They saw the blood of Prasena. They saw the claws of the lion that had blood on them. And what was missing was the Shamataka jewel. So anyway, the principle is you stand by the truth. Remain tolerant and stand by the truth. So in his case, the response was, he just spoke the truth. He spoke transcendental knowledge. To a person who he understood, doesn't say specifically, but there must have been, because previously he wouldn't say anything to anybody about anything. And he spoke to Rahugana, a whole bunch, like chapters, and very elevated. So, and Rahugana could understand it because he was a qualified man. He just was proud. And because he was proud, he did harsh things. And those harsh things caused some waves of dissatisfaction in the mind. So if you're aligned with the place of shelter, at the heart level, that's your shelter, and you practice it and practice and practice, something may come in the mind level or the body level that's disturbing. And then you can choose what you're going to do or not do, because you have shelter. And that was the asset of Jad Bharat. And what it says, after this he began to wander all over the earth just as before. And I'm going to end shortly. There's a very similar passage in amongst the sons, the 9, no, different. In Uddhava Gita, Uddhava is being instructed by Krishna in Uddhava Gita. And to understand the nature of what happens when you get disturbed and you don't have proper shelter, you get disturbed. And then it doesn't commonly, not always, but commonly the insults and injury things will increase and escalate because you got disturbed. It worked. So people will do it some more. So in Canto 11, chapter 23, Krishna narrates on the topic of becoming disturbed. He narrates the story of the Avanti Brahmana, and here's 2 verses from the beginning part. Lord Krishna said, "There's virtually no saintly man in this world capable of resettling his own mind after it has been disturbed by the insulting words of uncivilized men." So if you fall in that category of a saintly person, and if you hear some disturbing words from uncivilized men, you're in good company. And then what? Sharp arrows which pierce one's chest and reach the heart do not cause as much suffering as the arrows of harsh, insulting words that become lodged within the heart when spoken by uncivilized men. So that's the beginning of this chapter, and our last slide is this one. The Avanti Brahmana narration is an historical account related by Lord Sri Krishna to Uddhava, which teaches how to tolerate the insults of others. So he got spun out because he was hurting other people, and because he was hurting other people, he lost everything that he was proud of, and then he was destitute, and then people were insulting him. So he was trying to understand why is this happening and what to do. And he came to the right position. So the Bhagavatam is there for us to indicate, what to do when circumstances are troubling, because it does happen. Sometimes it looks nice, and it's a trick of the illusory energy, because it's not what real nice is. But it looks nice. There's something out there in the field of the senses, and someone is praising, or you're getting something or something. Oh, this is good. And then, this is a little Prabhupada saying from Henry Street. Maya is beckoning. Come on and enjoy me. Come on and enjoy me. Come on and enjoy me so I can kick you in the face. Now there's something in Greek mythology. Does anyone here know a little bit about Greek mythology? There's a lady, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but it's Cyrene or Siren or something. And she's out at sea and she's beckoning the sailors. Same, it's just, a take from Vedic culture, from Greek mythology. Come on and enjoy me so I can kick you in the face. That's not a nice person. But that goes on. It's the illusory energy, beckoning. Come on over here, there's enjoyment. So the devotees know how to say no. And they know how to say no because they have shelter. Supposing you don't have shelter, then it's easy to fall prey to an appeal to come and enjoy. And that's our life. It's a fundamental, it's allegorical in one sense, but it's not in real life. It's just when there's an appeal to be an enjoyer of something, it's the trick of Maya, because it's not enjoyment. And behind the cloak, there's the dagger. The real happiness is taken from you, and everything can be taken from you. So, praise or insult. How do you deal with praise? How do you deal with insult? If you don't have shelter, there's different responses depending upon personality types. And if you have shelter, that if there's something nice, it goes to Krishna. There's something not nice, let me try to improve myself so I can get full shelter and not be disturbed by those words. Okay, so that's a nice lesson. Many nice lessons. The 3 lives of Bharata Maharaj. Saturday afternoon in the suburbs of Houston, Texas. A lot of people here. Thanks for coming. See if there's some discussion. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki. I see a hand in the back. We have a microphone so people remote can also hear.
So, Hare Krishna Maharaj, in the context of this Bharata Maharaj narration, who was a devotee at the Bhava Bhakti level, I'm trying to understand and reconcile the promise given by Krishna in Bhagavad Gita, which he says, Yoga Kshemam Vahamyaham, I will carry what you lack and I will preserve what you have. So, could Krishna have prevented all this?
Oh yeah. He's the supreme controller. However, Krishna doesn't interfere with free will, and as we read from Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur's commentary, he was putting him in the fast lane. Bring him back to him quickly. He didn't have to do that. He did it in a unique way. But, he, King Bharat, was responsible for his offense. Now, Krishna can excuse one of offense. And Krishna may not, because there may be something that this person, or you, or me, or somebody needs to learn from that offense. And in the learning from that offense means unmixed shelter. There can be mixed or unmixed. So, best to not second guess. The Supreme Controller knows best. And he's kind. He does which is best, knowing, very customized for each one of us. Suppose he just, says, Bharata Maharaj, you did some offense, but that's okay. Then he may not learn his lesson. So he certainly learned his lesson. And he had some further service for him, instructing Rahugana, who's a good man. He just was, in La La Land thinking, I'm the king. And he changed, and all of that changed because in association with Chad Bharat. So, the complexities of the chess game of life and how Supreme Lord moves us on his chessboard to do some service for him over here or over there. There's lots of those kinds of things. Lots of those kinds of things. Here's one of my favorite ones. Muchukunda. After Muchukunda recognized Krishna and offered his prayers, Krishna could have just taken him back to Godhead. But he didn't. He didn't say why exactly, but you live the rest of your life undergoing penance for your mistakes. You'll become a Brahmin in your next life, and after that you'll come back to me. So it doesn't say, here's 10 services I have planned for you in your next life. It's not detailed, but we can be sure Krishna's kind, and there was some service to help him be of service to others in a very unique way. We don't have to know. We just have to have our confidence that Krishna is very kind to us and everybody. And we may not understand his plan. That's quite okay. We're not omniscient. But we, in God we trust. He can do things in so many different ways. Someone else. Who has the microphone? Someone else had their hand up. Okay, right next to you. Kirti.
Hare Krishna Maharaj. Thank you for the class. In the first life, Bharata Maharaj was moved by the plight of the deer, and in the second, in the third, he was moved by King Rahugana's plight. And how he responded to both situations were very different. In the in the case of King Rahugana, it was uplifting for Rahugana. My question is, in my day-to-day life, I see many people suffering. There are so many philanthropic causes. How do I respond to them without risking my bhakti at the same time, adding some value to the other person?
It depends where your shelter is.
Could you speak more about it? Could you explain?
Sure. Supposing somebody has the profession of a doctor. What's one of the chief motivators, higher motivations for persons who are doctors, is helping people. So there's nothing wrong with that. That's good. However, if it's just helping people on the bodily platform and it stops there, that's not what the essence of what helping people is. But supposing there's somebody that's a Vaishnava physician, like Murari Gupta in Chaitanya Charitamrita, he would heal people physically and also spiritually, because that's what's behind physical illness, is spiritual illness, for example. The topic yesterday evening at Texas A&M was on this topic. I mean, part of it was on this topic. One of the slides showed a pyramid or triangle, and within the triangle there's a central triangle with three sides, and there's the triangle of body, mind, and heart, and in the center is the soul. So take care of any one of the outside ones. It's insufficient without the spiritual one. And the spiritual one will naturally have a byproduct of having compassion, physical, mental, or emotional platform. And then you do whatever the capacity that Krishna gives you. Something else?
Hare Krishna Maharaj, very nice class. I was appreciating this one of the comment you made about we may be doing so many devotional activities at physical activity level, but mind may not be involved in there. You cited the verse Manmana Bhava Mad Bhakto, so which I really liked, where so how do we, along with the activities, how do we really invest mind always?
Follow the sadhana bhakti process properly, because it's not just a behavior. Madgate nantaratmana shradhavan bhajate yomam. So there's those two parts. What the mind does and what the body does. And that's an instruction. You hear the instruction, you follow the instruction. So they're both are important, not just what the body does. Continue on the activity platform, and then there's the subtle activity. And they're both imperative for bhakti to be complete. Supposing we're stronger in one area and weaker in the other area. Commonly, that's the case. So recognize where it's not strong, you keep doing what's strong, and then you give extra attention from this where you have some strength to where it's not so strong. You practice sadhana bhakti in both areas. And, keep good association, sadhu sangha. And in sadhu sangha, then you'll have further purification so you can see more vividly where the weakness is. And you have sadhu sangha to help you go to the area where the weakness is, and not with shame or feeling badly, but you invest in making that strong. And that's our life. That's the how-to. Sadhu Sangha is the short answer. But you follow what Krishna says in the association of those who are nicely following what Krishna says. Our host wants to say something. I think you have to hit the button.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj.
Yeah, that's much better.
It was a nice talk on Bharata Maharaj, 3 different stages. And my question is, you mentioned Gajendra delivered very quickly, but we have heard if he was fighting for 10,000 years. Is that a quickly or?
That's relative, isn't it? Whatever the duration was, it could have been much longer if it didn't happen like that. His very next life. What about you? No, don't look over your shoulder. What about you? If you knew in your next life you'd become a pure devotee and Lord Vishnu would come and deliver you, would you say yes, or let me think about it? Yes. What if it's a long time before that lifetime is over? Yes. Now, he didn't have that verbal reassurance, but supposing you did, yes. Now, it's not just numerical, it's qualitative. But he had absolute no other shelter. Akinchanatvam, ananyagatitvam. This is from Ramayana. 2 of the essential characteristics of the person who wants shelter. I have no other shelter, you're my only shelter. Now to get there, may take some inconvenience. Say yes to the inconvenience. For the right purpose behind the saying yes to the inconvenience. Okay? Yeah.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj. In one of the question you answered, for a profession, let's say for doctor profession, one is like bodily treatment or bodily care, but you also mentioned like spiritual care or spiritual treatment. So what is specifically, like in certain times, like what spiritual treatment a doctor can?
Well, the medical profession is a little tricky because you can't be a preacher in the medical profession. It's a little tricky. But you must know, I know, some persons who work in, there's a lot of scrutiny in the medical profession to not, twist people's arms. Because it's a power position. You're taking care of, and they're completely in your care. So you have to be careful. I know doctors to describe what they do and how they do it. And it's, it's gentle and depending upon the person. Because they can be spanked by the medical profession. So you have to be careful. But, they know how to do it. If these conscientious persons in hospitals, they have a private practice, you can go further. But there's still oversight. So you have to know your boundaries and you have to know the person. But if that's what's in your heart, it comes out. Let's go with the microphone over here. Two comments and we're going to end. He wants the last word.
Maharaj, you said to tolerate, it depends on the way the shelter is.
Yes.
So, for person I'm mixed bhakta. So for me, what is a practical thing I can do or that can help me tolerate? Because when it comes to outside people, I'm able to tolerate, but when it comes to my as a parent or as a wife, my tolerance levels will be is difficult. So, what is the practical thing I can do to help me tolerate?
This question came up yesterday evening. The context was different, but I made reference to Queen Kunti's prayers, and Rishta found the reference from Canto 1, Chapter 8, where Kunti is praying to Krishna. These aren't her exact words, but she's praying to Krishna to please remove the material portion of my attachment to my sons and to my father's family. Doesn't not remove the attachment, the material portion. So it's stronger over in certain areas because of attachment. So what do? You pray to Krishna and become attached more on the spiritual and ask Krishna to help you overcome the undue affinity for the material side. And that's part of, the opportunity that you have of being a mother and a wife. Or, expand it and go into the community. So don't have a community and don't have a husband and don't have any children and you become an impersonalist and no problems, right? But we don't do that. So we address our situation by, so it's this same, Krishna, you're my shelter, and I have undue affinity on the material side. Even I have affinity for you. I'm a mixed devotee. So please help me with this mix. And let my attachment be to you. And the soul of my family members and their relation with Krishna being at the center of my affinity and affection. So it takes a while because we're conditioned. And you cultivate like that. Last. You have something more? Okay.
Guru Maharaj, what Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur said about Bharata Maharaj, does that necessarily mean that because he's not mentioning the offense part in his comment, does that mean that Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is saying no offense,
No,
but
he's
he
not
just
saying
wanted
that.
to put him in the fast lane?
No, it's not saying that. It's an add-on.
Okay. The other question I have is, sometimes I wonder, does any of our acharyas say anything why King Bharat had to take 2 lives, maybe not 1?
That's the first question. There's not explanation of why
Okay.
2 instead of 1.
Okay. The third question
It's
I
just
have.
like the plan of the Lord has, something customized for each
Sure.
of us.
Yeah. The third question I have is Rishabh Dev's life. The one thing is the renunciation. Is there any other message out of his life besides just renunciation?
Well, no, there's nothing. Yes, there's not the only thing. There's attached to renunciation based on what? And his renunciation was extreme, but his attachment to the Supreme was also. Now he's an incarnation demonstrating detachment to the extreme, but detachment as a lesson, giving personality, is attachment to the Supreme. And then different acharyas, for example, what to speak of incarnations, they'll show different features of attachment to the Supreme. and thus detachment from matter.
What should I get out of this?
What's your nature? That's what you should get.
With the extreme level that these avatutas go.
Here's Acharya, here's examples, and which is most close to my nature. And let me not imitate, but let me understand principles. Let's take, from the other side, Ambarish Maharaj, Yudhisthira Maharaj. These are what our acharyas point to. Prahlad Maharaj. So much opulence. And they weren't enamored by it. And then there's others on the other side. Abject disinterest. Jad Bharat is one that's pointed to by our acharyas. Or Sudama Brahman. No interest at all. Specifically, if offered, no thanks. Not like, don't disturb my mind. Why are you disturbing my mind? It's no thanks. Because that's this nature of renunciation. And therefore the Lord didn't disturb him. But he was married to someone who was concerned about his maintenance, and so the Lord bestowed. And he didn't become disturbed when there wasn't, and he didn't become disturbed when there was opulence. So they're different natures. This is customized relationship. However works best for our pure, unconditioned relationship with Krishna. That the main concern, the takeaway for us is, what's my nature? And more important even is what does Krishna want from me? What's going to be pleasing to him? And that's what we go for. We strive in that direction, at least, according to our nature.
Thank you, Guru Maharaj.
Okay, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Or Premanandi. This could go on for longer, but I'm going to end. Okay. A lot of people here today.
One small announcement. There is a car, black car, window is open, 211